Hi, my name is Evan Harper, and I'm a social work intern at Garden Oaks Montessori this year. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about an uncomfortable topic, and that's self-harm. So, this conversation will cover the basics about what exactly self-harm is, why some people do it, where, and most importantly, how you should handle it if your child is self-harming. So, first thing, I want to start by defining both what self-harm is and is not. At the very basic level, self-harm is any kind of intentional physical harm someone commits against themselves. This can take many different forms, but the most common form is the cutting or carving of the skin, usually with a razor or other sharp object. Some other forms are burning, hitting oneself, implanting objects underneath the skin, or biting yourself. Most of the time, the marks from these actions are in places that are easy to hide, such as the arms or the stomach, but we'll come back to that later. Before we go any further, though, I also want to address what self-harm is not. Most importantly, self-harm is usually not an attempt at suicide. In fact, often self-harm is a method of coping so that the harmer will not attempt to kill themselves. We'll talk more in depth about this in the next section, but it's important to note that, if not addressed, self-harmers are at a significant risk of attempting suicide in the future. Secondly, self-harm is also usually not attention-seeking. Self-harm is typically an intensely private and hidden behavior, and the harmer will usually go to great lengths to conceal it. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, self-harm is rarely the root problem. Instead, self-harm is typically a symptom of deeper psychological or emotional difficulties. Harmer is likely using it as a method of coping with thoughts and feelings that must be addressed in order for them to make a full, long-lasting recovery. Now, some of you may be wondering, why would someone hurt themselves? So, it may help to imagine a pressure cooker as the life of the harmer. Then imagine all of the different stresses and pressures that someone faces. These can be things like romantic relationships, family relationships, school, jobs, friends, emotions, genetic differences. All of these things create stress in the life and build up pressure inside the cooker. Now, most of us tend to have pressure release valves in the form of coping mechanisms. So these can be things like meditation, hobbies, positive relationships, or mindsets. Basically, really just anything that helps us to de-stress, relax, and deal with our different stresses and issues. However, if someone does not possess those skills, then they need to find some other method of relieving this stress. Self-harming provides an outlet, often in the form of distraction and endorphins that are released, and it tends to give people, and it can give someone a sense of control over what's maybe an out-of-control feeling. Now, there are 4 primary functions for self-harm. Most common are self-regulation, control, and distraction. So self-harm can help to distract these from unwanted or uncomfortable emotions, such as sadness or anger, which they feel they are otherwise unable to control. The act of harming means that they are able to focus on the physical sensation and otherwise ignore those feelings. This can also provide them with a sense of regaining control over their own lives that may have been previously absent. Another function it may perform is as a form of self-punishment. A lot of harmers do so in part because they feel ashamed or guilty of previous actions. This is especially true if they are ashamed of the harming behavior, because the shame compounds each time they harm, meaning that they feel greater shame, which results in them harming even more, creating a vicious cycle. It's one of the reasons that it's so incredibly important to act as soon as discovery of the behavior is made. And finally, self-harming can also provide a form of relief for the harmer. The act of cutting does result in the body releasing endorphins as it attempts to cope with the physical pain. These endorphins provide a natural feeling of happiness, and that sensation can have addictive properties. Harmer can become overwhelmingly preoccupied with this feeling and is forced to escalate behaviors over time as they build up tolerances, requiring more extreme sensations to experience the chemical release. Okay, now that you have a better understanding of why this takes place, let's address the question of where someone may harm. So, as mentioned before, self-harm is usually a hidden behavior, and that means that the harmer is usually going to do so in places that are easily hidden. So, the most common areas of the body that this takes place are the arms, wrists, stomach, legs, and yes, feet, especially the bottoms. All of these are places which can be easily covered with clothing or accessories and tend to require special attention to detail in order to notice. Please note, though, these are not the only places that the behavior is used, and attention should be given to the body as a whole, especially if a behavior is started to escalate as the user becomes more desperate for that sensation. With more desperation becomes decreased inhibitions about discovery in many cases. So, the next question likely is, who is most at risk for this behavior? And the answer to that question is basically anyone who feels out of control is at risk of self-harming. Now, so let's go ahead and break this down a little bit. Although it's most often associated with women, the fact is that both men and women self-harm. Anywhere from 35 to 50% of self-harmers identifying as male. It's possible that male self-harmers are even more likely to be secretive and ashamed of this behavior, given that it's so often seen as a feminine behavior and their desire to avoid appearing weak. It should be noted that transgendered people do seem to self-harm more often, though evidence of this is still limited and not fully explored. Before we go any further, I want to address, this is not due to any kind of inherent mental illness or psychological difficulty in trans individuals. Instead, it is highly likely that it's instead due to an increased inner turmoil with sense of self and who they are, and also from external factors such as rejected by social groups, rejected by parents, and just feeling like general outcasts of society. And that effect is especially pronounced when the individual feels unable to discuss these feelings with those people around them. Another factor to consider is age. Most self-harm tends to start in the early teen years. However, in women, they do tend to start younger than men on average. But once again, this is not a hard and fast rule, simply a trend. That said, the two most important risk factors are life issues and mental health difficulties. People who have unstable or dysfunctional relationships and/or a history of personal trauma are most likely to struggle with positive coping skills and are by far the most at risk of negative coping behaviors such as self-harm. Together, these two factors serve as the best predictors of who is most likely to turn to self-harming as a coping tool. With those factors in mind, let's turn to the question of warning signs that your child may be self-harming. Before we get to that though, I want to state that none of these are concrete indicators that your child is harming. The best way to discover the behavior is to build a strong, open relationship with your child so that they will feel comfortable discussing difficult behaviors now and in the future. So, first and most obvious sign are body marks. Obviously, though, people get hurt accidentally just by living life. They accidentally hurt themselves in any number of different ways, so marks by themselves are not proof. However, repeated instances of these marks are a good indicator that there may be an issue which needs some addressing. Another sign is if your child has hidden instruments which could be used to harm. Because it's a hidden, typically ritualistic behavior, the specific instrument is likely to be well hidden and difficult to find somewhere in their room or common area that they tend to use. Another indicator is isolating from others frequently and for long periods of time, especially after negative emotional experiences. So things like getting into an argument with parents, having a really hard day at school, breaking up, all of these are considered negative emotional or can be considered negative emotional experiences, and so are times to be on the lookout. And lastly, clothing choice. Now, this is simultaneously the easiest to identify as well as the hardest to classify as a warning sign. So just because someone enjoys long clothes does not mean that they're self-harming. Get that out of the way right now. However, if it is taken in combination with the other signs mentioned, and if inappropriate for the climate, so for instance, if they're wearing like very, very dark, very long, heavy clothing in August, it can be an important warning sign and something to be on the lookout for. So, what can you do to prevent self-harming as a parent? Well, one thing that you can do is increase bonding time. So that means increase the amount of time spent with your child and just generally pay attention to them. Positive, healthy relationships are the single best preventative measure against self-harming, as it opens the opportunity for the harmer to talk about how they're feeling and work through their emotions and feelings of powerlessness. Another tactic is to share your own experiences with struggles and difficulties. Feelings of hopelessness are common amongst those who self-harm, and hearing about others being able to persist despite challenges may help them to challenge their own unhealthy behaviors. Similarly, not only share your own stories, but create space and opportunity for your child to do the same. It's important that if your child discusses a difficult situation or behavior with you, you do not react judgmentally or angrily. Your child may be testing the waters to gauge your reaction if something larger is going on, and they will likely withdraw further into the behavior if you react negatively in this test. And finally, model some appropriate methods of coping with difficult situations for your child. Hiding your own struggles may create the impression in your child's mind that they're the only one struggling in life and contributing to their feelings of isolation. And finally, what do you do if you discover that your child is self-harming? So, first and foremost, avoid judgment and blame. In the moment, you may feel a hurricane of emotions: fear, anger, hurt. All of these are valid feelings. But if you lash out at your child for their behavior, they are far more likely to retreat further into it. Doing so will likely reinforce the feeling of isolation and shame in the harmer, which can then lead to extreme escalation in certain instances. Instead, it's important that you manage your reaction and approach the situation from a place of finding a solution. Self-harm is a serious issue which must be addressed, but it is not uncommon and it is not a life sentence. Many people have dealt with this behavior in the past and have seen full recovery. However, chance for recovery is increased exponentially by getting professional help. As mentioned earlier, self-harming is usually a symptom of a deeper issue and will likely require the help of a professional such as a therapist to fully address. The following slide includes information about how to find a local professional, and various other resources are included in the description of this video. And last but not least, you have to be realistic. Recovery from any behavioral disorder is not a straight line, and it is not fair to expect that your child will make an immediate recovery. Self-harming can be an addictive behavior, and it can be difficult for anyone to make a recovery. Relapsing may occur, but it's not a sign that they will not ever recover. Furthermore, it's likely going to take time for your child to develop other coping mechanisms that can supersede self-harm. Until then, they may stumble in their recovery, but it's important that in these instances, you continue to encourage and support them in making healthy behavioral choices. Thank you so much for your time and for just listening to me tell you about self-harm. On the screen right now are some resources that you can use to both find professional help and just places you can go to for help better understanding or for whoever is self-harming. Again, thank you for your time.